Can you hear me?
Yeah.
For today's FanDuel, we'll use that sort of generic.
Now, Ross Kaminsky.
Come on, man.
On Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
All right, good morning. Happy Wednesday. Happy National Beer Day. Yeah, National Beer Day. We're actually going to have a guest on the show to talk about some National Beer Day stuff later in the show. Why not? Baseball season opening. We got more beer. Maybe we get the All-Star game here, or now we get the All-Star game here, even though they should send it back to Atlanta. Anyway, is that what's going on in Atlanta? Oh, we got a lot to talk about today. We got some really good guests, too, and we'll get to all that. I got a lot of stories I want to deal with, but, of course, I need to start with the news that we got yesterday afternoon, and I don't know if you had a chance to hear my brief conversation with Dan Caplis on his show yesterday later in the afternoon, but Senate Bill 182 was killed yesterday, at least for this year. So that's a big deal. That is a very, very big deal. So in case you missed my talking about it or Dan Caplis talking about it, first let me just briefly describe what this thing would have been. It would have been a bill that would have prevented the ticketing or arrest of a student who committed essentially any misdemeanor, and there are some very serious misdemeanors.
Ross Report
like most forms of assault can be misdemeanors. You punch someone in the face and bloody their nose and bruise them all up. That's a misdemeanor. Certain kinds of unwanted sexual contact are misdemeanors. Vandalism and theft.
The small end maybe of mid-sized SUVs. Check out the new BMW X,
and it would have prevented
by the great people at L&L.
A student from being arrested if they had committed any of those crimes on school grounds, on a school bus, or even off of school property if at a school-sanctioned event. Imagine, I don't know, a school has a prom, and it's at some lovely event center somewhere, and a kid commits a crime there. It would have prevented the arrest of a kid for that. I want to make one thing clear. I've said this before, but I want to make it absolutely clear going forward here that I understand the perspective of the bill's proponents who are thinking, by the way, they are thinking entirely about inner city kids. This would have been a bill that applied to every kid in the state, but the people who were promoting it weren't thinking about suburban schools or rural schools at all. They were thinking only about inner city kids, so that's a problem. It's a problem that they're only thinking about one group of kids. And the idea, though, is that they believe that minority kids in particular have far too much contact with the criminal justice system for behavior that could or should be dealt with through other means like the school's own disciplinary system. And their goal was to not have kids get arrested or ticketed and, things like that they believe, even though juvenile records are sealed, but they believe that getting a kid involved in the criminal justice system early on has long-term negative impacts for that kid's life. And it probably does. It probably does. And so, look, I share the goal of not having a kid arrested for something that really is quite minor and could be dealt with in other ways. But if that's all they wanted to do, then they should have written that instead of writing what they wrote. There was a bunch of other stuff in the bill, a bunch of things that would have to be done as far as reporting discipline data and things like that. And you know what's funny? Dan Caplis and I both strongly objected to this bill, and nobody did more to fight against it, and probably nobody did more to cause the end of this bill than Dan Caplis did. But we both objected to it on the same grounds, and that is it made students and teachers targets of students who would be inclined toward criminal behavior, and it would make schools a magnet for crime because bad kids, and even if there aren't a huge number of them, you don't need a huge number, would know that the worst that could happen to them was to be suspended, or perhaps, but they couldn't be arrested. We got a tweet yesterday directed toward me and the radio station. I say directed, it wasn't like, I just mean tweeted toward our accounts. It wasn't really about us. And it was from someone who said that she's a teacher and she's glad that the bill failed because it would have required more paperwork. I guess we know what some people care about most. But the bill was pulled yesterday, and the two lead sponsors, State Rep Leslie Herod and State Senator Janet Buckner, put out a statement, and I want to share this with you because, well, I'm not going to say that I'm surprised, because several of my listeners, at my request, got in touch with their own state representatives, state senators. I asked in particular people who are represented by Democrats to get in touch with those people because we knew that all the Republicans were going to vote against this anyway. And some listeners forwarded me the responses that they got from those offices, and they were all either very misleading or outright lies. Completely ignoring, stating the goal, like, we don't want kids to get in the school to prison pipeline, right? Now, but they ignored the fact and spun and misled on the fact that the bill would have prevented arrest. They tried to spin it to my listeners, as a bill that would just make arrest less likely and other paths of discipline the preferred first paths forward. They didn't say that it would bar arrest, which it would. So they continued, the supporters of the bill continued with their spin and mendacity in the statement yesterday. I want you to listen to this. From 2014 to 2020, over 38,000 K through 12 students were ticketed and arrested in Colorado. The majority were for nonviolent offenses like smoking or alcohol. The intent of this bill was to rebalance how we think about discipline in our schools so they are a safe environment for all students. Okay, again, let me just say, if that was the end of the bill, then that's the bill you should have written, rather than the bill that you wrote. That'd be like, my driving 60 miles an hour in a school zone and risking the safety of all kinds of kids and, telling the officer, sorry, that wasn't my goal. I was trying to drive, 25 miles an hour, but, I just, it's really all the same, isn't it? No. Let me continue. Listen now. We're not talking about felonies. Now, that's true. The bill did not address felonies. We're talking about small things, like a kid having trouble at home who experiments with marijuana or tobacco, or a student with autism who struggles to calm down. Part of the bill also said you couldn't handcuff an elementary school student. By the way, handcuffing an elementary school student, while it's not a great look, may be the best thing for the student. It may be the best thing for people around the student if you have a truly out-of-control student who is hurting others and perhaps hurting himself. Nobody wants to handcuff a kid. But there might not always be a better answer. Anyway, back to the statement. It's true they're not talking about felonies, but saying we're talking about small things, which implies they're only talking about small things, like marijuana or tobacco, or a kid not calming down, is a wildly misleading description of what this bill would do. They continue, we wrote Senate Bill 182 to help move our state toward what we have heard law enforcement and school resource officers have said all along. School districts and law enforcement should be partners. School and community-based alternatives to criminal justice involvement should be utilized where safely possible, and tickets and arrests should be used as a last resort. We intended to lift up strong school resource officers that are working with students every day through restorative justice programs and not to prevent SROs in schools. Well, your boy Tay Anderson is preventing SROs in the largest school district in the state of Colorado for Denver Public Schools. So why don't you stand up and say something about that? Why don't you go to the Denver School Board and say, why are you letting this ignorant 22-year-old political grandstander lead adults around by the nose to get rid of SROs in Denver Public Schools, which is already passed the Denver School Board. So, hey, Leslie Herod, why don't you say something about that to your pal Tay? The statement continues, we did not create free zones where students are free from disciplinary action, and we strongly believe that a more balanced collaborative approach between schools and law enforcement will lead to stronger, safer, healthier schools where every child can reach their full potential, to which I say again, if that's what you wanted to do, then that's the bill you should have written. You did create free zones free from arrest. I did not say, Dan Caplis did not say, that the schools would be free from disciplinary action. We said they would be free from arrest. Another important point worth making. Some folks argue that we should keep a death penalty in place because the death penalty allows prosecutors to negotiate plea deals that might put someone in prison for years, obviously for murder, or prison for the rest of their life, without having to go through a trial. In other words, it's sort of a bit of a negotiating thing, even if you don't plan on giving them the death penalty. And I did hear a really interesting argument made that if bad kids, and again, I'm not saying there's huge numbers of these kids, but if bad kids know that they can't be arrested, there is a lot less fear and a lot less ability to use the threat of arrest to get the kid to agree to some other path. And remember, we're not talking about just the nice kid who is likely to be agreeable. We are talking about someone, in this specific example, who has committed some kind of crime that otherwise would be worthy of arrest. They didn't write a bill, despite their protestations, that pushed for a more balanced collaborative approach between schools and law enforcement. They wrote a bill that essentially cut law enforcement out of being able to do their jobs at schools. It was a terrible bill, and they just keep lying about it. The statement continues, after many conversations with educators and law enforcement, we believe there's not a path forward for Senate Bill 182. Now that's interesting. So they must have heard from teachers, and I don't know whether teachers went to them and said, we don't like this bill because you make us targets, or we don't like this bill because you're giving us more paperwork. I was really kind of shocked by seeing that tweet yesterday from a teacher who said that she was glad that this bill failed because it would have created more paperwork. Ugh. Also, we heard from law enforcement. They said, good, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you care. I made this point when I did a quick hit with Dan Caplis yesterday. Leslie Herod and Janet Buckner and people like this, far-left Democrats representing safely Democratic districts, do not care what I think, do not care what Dan Caplis thinks, and do not care what anybody who isn't already a Democratic voter or potentially could be a Democratic voter thinks. They don't care. They have no interest in what a Republican or Libertarian thinks because they know we're never voting for him anyway, and they don't actually intend to represent everyone who they nominally represent. They intend to represent the people who vote for them and only those people. And what's so important to beat something like this is to make sure that people who those politicians do care about, Democratic voters, parents, teachers, even law enforcement, get the message and go to these politicians and say this has to stop. While we have been disappointed by the divisive and inaccurate rhetoric around this bill, no, I am unaware of inaccurate rhetoric around the bill. The inaccurate rhetoric around the bill has actually come from your side, from the side supporting the bill. We remain committed, they say, to lifting up the voices of students and families who have faced the consequences of harsh discipline tactics. We remain committed to engaging in a collaborative process of finding solutions that work for all parties, and we look forward to building schools that are safe for all students. Again, if that's what you wanted to do, that's the bill you should have written. We encourage schools and law enforcement to work with us to ensure that students are centered as we continue to work toward a safer, more equitable education system. Lovely. There are few things more frustrating in the world of politics, in which there are a lot of frustrating things, than politicians who claim a particular motivation and then support legislation that does something very different, especially when you know that they are lying when they claim that a bill doesn't do what its plain language says it does. Plain language. And that was Senate Bill 182. We don't know if this thing is permanently dead. Most bad Democratic bills don't die permanent deaths. They come back as zombies with slight modifications, and they try them again until the sponsors realize it's never going to happen. So if they come back with the same bill next year, we got to be ready to beat it again next year. I'm guessing they'll come back with something that's modified. I doubt it'll be modified enough to actually make it a good bill. All right, I got about 90 seconds here before a little break, and I wanted to share this one story with you because it is just such a delicious story. Fox News and others are reporting that Caitlyn Jenner, formerly known as Bruce Jenner, Olympic athlete, is considering running for governor of California against Gavin Newsom as Newsom faces a recall.
She used to be a really good runner.
That's right. That's right. If Caitlyn Jenner can do anything, it's run. And I sent a tweet out yesterday. I said, grab the freaking popcorn, and if Caitlyn Jenner runs for governor, I will definitely contribute to that campaign. By the way, Jenner is a Republican, been a Republican for a long, long time. And according to Axios, which cited multiple sources, they said that Jenner, 71 years old now, is actively exploring a run for governor and working with... Why? Anyway, gosh, I hope this happens. I mean, look, if any Republican could win in California, it would be Caitlyn Jenner, right? Oh my gosh, do I want to see this. All right, we'll be right back. You know what I have for you next? A great letter about Major League Baseball's decision by the former head of MLB.
KHOW Denver, 630 KHOW, an iHeartRadio station. Available everywhere on our free iHeartRadio app. #1 for music, radio, and podcasts, all in one. Now, Impact Traffic.
This